The dust was a constant shroud, coating everything in a fine, gritty film that settled on skin, in lungs, and in the hollows of the soul. Eleanor pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it offered little defense against the chill that seeped up from the parched earth. She stood at the edge of the small, huddled group, watching the rough-hewn wagon that served as a temporary stage for human misery. Word had spread like wildfire through the makeshift camp. The wagon master, Josiah, his wife lost to the fever just days after delivering twins, was divesting himself of the burden. There was no sentiment here, only survival, stark and brutal. Eleanor understood survival. It had been her unwelcome companion for years. The ache in her own arms, an emptiness that echoed the loss of a future she had once envisioned, tightened in her chest. She had watched other families, seen the easy way women held their babes, a world away from her solitary existence. Now this Josiah, a man hardened by trail and sorrow, stood beside a rough crate lined with what looked like torn bits of canvas. His face was a mask of grief and exhaustion, but his voice, when he spoke, was flat and devoid of tenderness. "Got two here," he announced to the sparse assembly of weary travelers and opportunistic locals. "Born 2 days past. Boy and a girl. Mother didn't make it." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd, a mix of pity and calculation. Newborns were a liability on the trail, a drain on resources, a risk. Yet, the cruel curiosity of the auction held them. "Need someone to take him. Ain't got the means or the milk." He gestured vaguely at the crate. "What's offered?" Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the whimpering cries that rose faintly from the crate. Eleanor felt a jolt, sharp and visceral, that cut through her own desolation. 2 lives, barely begun, reduced to chattel in the dust. She saw the calculating eyes of a burly man known for taking in orphans, who quickly became unpaid labor. She saw the averted gazes of women already burdened by too many mouths to feed. No one stepped forward with genuine care, only cold appraisal. The auctioneer, a slick-haired man named Silas, stepped forward, rubbing his hands. "Right then. Let's see what these little souls fetch. Start and bid." He didn't get to finish. Eleanor moved, her feet carrying her forward before her mind could register the sheer folly of it. She had nothing to offer, no coin, no property of value. Her possessions could be tied in a single blanket. Yet, she walked towards the wagon, the dust puffing around her worn boots. Every eye turned to her. Eleanor, the quiet woman who kept to herself, who seemed as rootless as the tumbleweeds. Josiah's tired eyes fixed on her, a flicker of surprise, then impatience. Silas looked annoyed, his potential profit delayed. Eleanor reached the wagon and looked into the crate. 2 tiny faces, red and wrinkled, lay nestled together, their cries weak but persistent. They were impossibly small, fragile against the vast indifference of the landscape. "I'll take them," Eleanor said, her voice thin but clear. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas frowned. "And what precisely would be your bid, ma'am?" he asked, his tone laced with derision. The burly man snorted. Eleanor met Silas's gaze, then Josiah's. She had no answer that made sense in their world of transactions. "My care," she said simply, her eyes pleading with Josiah, not for charity, but for understanding. "I have no coins, no land, but I have hands to work, and a heart that isn't full." She touched her chest, a raw, involuntary gesture. Josiah stared at her, his grief-clouded mind perhaps seeing something beyond the immediate transaction. He looked at the babies, then at the predatory eyes of the others gathered. A slow, agonizing breath escaped him. He reached into the crate, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted one infant, then the other. He held them out to Eleanor. "Take 'em," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "They're yours. May God have mercy on us all." He placed the small, bundled forms into her outstretched arms. The weight was astonishing, both physical and emotional. 2 lives, utterly dependent, nestled against her. They smelled faintly of milk and newborn sweetness, a scent so foreign and yet so deeply resonant. Eleanor held them tightly, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, but a fierce protective instinct rising swiftly to meet it. The murmuring resumed, louder this time, laced with disapproval and doubt. Silas looked ready to protest, but Josiah turned his back, his shoulders slumped, and walked away, effectively ending the auction. Eleanor stood alone, holding the future in her arms, surrounded by faces that offered no help, only judgment. The dust settled back over the scene, indifferent to the human drama it had witnessed. She was alone, responsible for two fragile lives in a world that barely tolerated her own. The sun dipped lower towards the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows. She needed shelter, warmth, and a miracle. She stood there for a long moment, the weight of the infants pressing into her arms, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her spirit. The crowd dispersed quickly, losing interest now that there was no spectacle, no transaction to observe. Silas cast her a final, contemptuous glance before following Josiah. The burly man merely grunted, his eyes sharp with speculation, before melting back into the camp's anonymity. Eleanor was left utterly alone in the fading light, the two small bodies stirring restlessly in her grasp. Their whimpers were louder now, more insistent. Hunger, cold, fear, all the things she suddenly had to shield them from. Her mind reeled. Where would she go? What would she do? She had acted purely on instinct, on a profound, aching need to prevent a terrible wrong, without a single practical thought for the consequences. She turned slowly, scanning the desolate landscape of the camp. Tents, wagons, lean-tos, scattered fires, a transient, uncaring collection of souls. No one met her eyes. She was an anomaly, a woman with two babies she couldn't possibly care for, a burden taken on out of foolishness or madness. She stumbled slightly, her legs suddenly weak. The infants cried out, their small voices piercing the quiet. Panic began to set in, a cold wave washing over her. How could she feed them? Keep them warm through the night? Protect them? She sank slowly to the ground, leaning against the wheel of a long-abandoned wagon, pulling the babies tighter. She felt tears welling up, hot and useless. Then, a shadow fell over her. Eleanor flinched, instinctively shielding the babies. She looked up into a face that was weathered and lined, with eyes that held a deep, quiet knowing. It was the man they called Caleb, an enigma who kept to himself, his past unknown, his presence a silent fixture on the edges of the community. He wasn't part of any wagon train, he seemed to just exist here, a solitary figure always observing, rarely speaking. He carried himself with a stillness that was both unsettling and oddly reassuring. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes. His gaze rested on the infants in her arms for a moment, then lifted to meet hers. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, only a calm assessment of the situation. He didn't ask why she had done it. He didn't ask how she would manage. Instead, he simply gestured with his head towards a small, sturdy lean-to built against a rock formation some distance away, slightly separate from the main camp. It was a shelter he had built for himself, offering more protection than the flimsy tents. Then, without a word, he walked towards it. Eleanor hesitated for only a second. She had no other option. Gathering her strength, she rose, awkwardly balancing the two bundles, and followed him. When she reached the lean-to, he was already inside, clearing a small space. He had spread a thicker blanket on the ground, a quality she hadn't expected him to possess. He knelt and carefully built a small fire in a stone ring just outside the entrance, ensuring it was sheltered from the wind. The warmth, small as it was, felt like salvation. He then disappeared briefly and returned with a waterskin and a small, tightly wrapped package. He placed them silently beside her. The package contained hardtack and a piece of dried meat, meager provisions, but more than she had. He still hadn't spoken a single word. Eleanor sat by the fire, trying to hush the babies, feeling utterly overwhelmed. Caleb sat opposite her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His presence was a shield against the encroaching darkness and the unseen threats it held. She knew nothing about him, only that he hadn't turned away. She needed help, desperate, fundamental help. These babies needed milk and she had none. She needed guidance, warmth, and protection. She looked at him, the firelight casting his face in deep shadow. I don't know what to do," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. His sharpening stopped. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He still didn't speak, but he reached into a pouch and pulled out a small, leather-bound flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. Goat's milk, she realized, warm and slightly sweet. A flicker of hope ignited in the despair. He stayed with her through the night, a silent, watchful sentinel. He added wood to the fire, his movements quiet and efficient. When one of the babies cried inconsolably, he didn't offer to hold it, but his presence was a strange comfort in her fumbling attempts to soothe the tiny creature. She managed to coax a few drops of milk from the flask into the infant's mouths using a strip of cloth, a slow, painstaking process that brought only temporary relief. The night was long and cold, filled with the fragile sounds of the newborns and the vast, empty silence of the plains. Eleanor learned more from Caleb's silence than from any words. His actions spoke of competence, preparedness, and a quiet, unexpected capacity for aid. He wasn't a savior, not in the way stories were told, but a rock in the swirling current of her fear. By dawn, she was exhausted but resolute. She had survived the first night, and she hadn't been entirely alone. Days blurred into a challenging rhythm of survival. The babies' cries dictated their lives. Feeding them remained the biggest hurdle. Caleb continued to provide small amounts of goat's milk, somehow acquired from a source he didn't reveal, but it was never quite enough. Eleanor tried softening hardtack with water, offering tiny amounts, but the infants were too young. Desperation gnawed at her. She spent hours trying to find someone with a nursing infant, but the few women with babes were either too poor to spare their own milk or suspicious of her sudden charge. The looks she received from others in the camp hadn't softened. If anything, they had hardened into resentment and distrust. She and Caleb and the babies were outsiders, a unit formed by strange circumstances, viewed with wary eyes. Caleb continued to be a silent, constant presence. He expanded the lean-to, making it more secure against the wind. He set snares and hunted small game, sharing the meager results. He mended her worn boots and sharpened her small knife. He built a more substantial fire pit, lined with rocks to hold the heat. He didn't teach her with words, but by doing, by example. Eleanor watched him, learning to read the subtle signs of the weather, to identify edible plants, to move with less wasted motion. Her initial vulnerability began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination and a growing practicality. She found strength she hadn't known she possessed, fueled by the absolute necessity of keeping the babies alive. She named them quietly. When Caleb was out hunting Lily and Thomas, simple names for simple, precious lives. She talked to them, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, held them close, sharing her own body heat. They were starting to thrive slowly against the odds. They recognized her voice, their tiny hands fisted in her worn dress. They were hers now in every way that mattered. And Caleb, he was part of their fragile world. He never held them, never touched them directly, but his actions wrapped around them like a protective cloak. He kept them safe from the harsh environment, from the probing questions of others, from the casual cruelty that permeated their existence. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the sky, Silas, the auctioneer, approached their lean-to. He didn't come too close, stopping a few yards away, his hands on his hips. Caleb, who had been mending a piece of canvas, stopped his work, his body becoming still, alert. Eleanor instinctively pulled the babies closer. Silas's gaze flickered towards the infants, then back to Eleanor. "Heard those little troubles are still kickin'," Silas called out, his voice too loud, too jovial. Eleanor didn't respond. Caleb rose slowly, not moving towards Silas, but simply standing between him and the lean-to. His silence was a more potent warning than any words. Silas seemed unfazed. "That Josiah fella cut himself a poor deal, letting him go for free," he continued, stepping a little closer. "Folks are saying a man could make something off young ones, especially a boy. Strong back in 10, 12 years. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. He saw them not as children, but as future labor, as property. "Maybe I could make an offer," Silas pressed, taking another step. "Taking off your hinges. Save you the trouble." His eyes were cold, calculating. This was the specific threat, emerging from the background hum of hardship. He represented the world's view of these babies, dispensable, exploitable. Caleb took a single step forward. He still said nothing, but his posture, the angle of his body, the set of his jaw, communicated a clear and absolute boundary. Silas stopped, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to being challenged by the quiet man. "Just a thought," Silas said, his tone losing some of its bluster. "Hard road for a woman alone. Even with company," he glanced at Caleb. "Might reconsider if things get too lean." He lingered for another moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the camp. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking. Caleb remained standing for a moment longer, watching the direction Silas had gone. Then he turned back and resumed mending the canvas, his movements calm once more. But the air felt different, charged with a new tension. The threat was real. It wasn't just the environment or lack of food anymore. It was the predatory nature of man. That night, Caleb built the fire higher, and his silence seemed more deliberate, more watchful. Eleanor looked at the sleeping faces of Lily and Thomas, nestled close, and felt a wave of fierce, protective love. She would not let them be taken. Not ever. The encounter with Silas solidified something unspoken between Eleanor and Caleb. They were a unit, bound by the fragile lives they protected. The days that followed were underscored by a new wariness. Caleb rarely left the vicinity of the lean-to for long, his hunting radius shrinking. Eleanor, too, became more vigilant, her eyes scanning the camp for unwelcome observers. They spoke little, as always, but their communication deepened beyond words. A shared glance conveyed understanding. A subtle movement signaled caution. Necessity had forged a partnership, a silent, resilient alliance against a world that seemed determined to either ignore them or exploit them. One biting cold morning, as a thin, sharp wind whipped through the camp, the worst happened. Food had been scarce for days. Lily's cries were weaker than usual, thin and reedy with hunger. Eleanor held her, desperate, tears streaming down her face. There was no milk left, no prospect of finding any. She felt the familiar panic rising, threatening to consume her. She looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading. He looked at Lily, his face etched with a rare flicker of helplessness. He stood up, his gaze distant, burdened. Eleanor knew what he was thinking. There were other options, desperate options. Giving them up to someone who could feed them, perhaps, or worse. Just as despair threatened to break her completely, a commotion erupted in the main camp. Shouting, shrill cries. Silas. He was back, this time not alone. Two rough-looking men were with him. They were heading directly for the lean-to. "There they are," Silas yelled, pointing. "Got buyers this time. Good coin for livestock." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Livestock. They saw the babies as animals to be traded. She scrambled back into the lean-to, pulling the infants behind her, her heart pounding against her ribs. Caleb stood his ground, facing the approaching men. He held the knife he had been sharpening, not aggressively, but ready. "They ain't for sale," he said, his voice low and steady for the first time Eleanor had truly heard him speak at length. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a fact. Silas laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Says who? The woman took 'em for free. They got no owner. And we got coin. Move aside, drifter." Caleb didn't move. The two men with Silas looked uneasy. sensing the quiet danger in the man. Silas, however, was emboldened by greed. He rushed forward. Caleb moved with surprising speed, not attacking, but deflecting. His knife flashed not to draw blood, but to warn, to create distance. Silas stumbled back with a yelp. The two men hesitated. Eleanor watched from the lean-to, clutching the babies. Fear warred with a sudden surge of fury. They wanted to take her children, children she had claimed from the dust, children she had fought to keep alive. She wasn't the helpless woman who had sunk by the wagon wheel anymore. She was their protector. She grabbed a thick piece of firewood from beside the pit. She stepped out of the lean-to, standing beside Caleb, facing the men. She held the wood like a club, her stance defensive. "Get away from us," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They are ours. You won't touch them." Silas stared at her, surprised by her defiance. He hadn't expected the quiet woman to show such spirit. Caleb glanced at her, a fleeting look of understanding passing between them. The two men saw the united front, the desperate, dangerous resolve in their eyes. They looked at each other, then back at Silas. This wasn't the easy transaction he had promised. With a frustrated curse, Silas backed down. "This ain't over," he snarled, but he knew he was beaten, at least for now. He and his men retreated, melting back into the indifference of the camp. The silence returned, heavy with adrenaline. Eleanor dropped the firewood, her knees weak. Caleb lowered his knife. He looked at Eleanor, then at the babies in her arms. For the first time, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. It wasn't just him protecting them. She was part of the defense, a fierce, unwavering force. They survived that day and the ones that followed. The threat of Silas remained, a shadow, but it seemed the message had been sent. This small, unlikely family unit was defended. Spring eventually arrived, tentative at first, then with a surge of green life that promised new possibilities. They found a small, sheltered valley with a reliable water source, a place to stop, at least for a while. Caleb built a more substantial shelter, a cabin of sorts. Eleanor found ways to forage, to make the most of what little they had. The babies grew, their cries stronger, their eyes beginning to focus on her face, on Caleb's quiet one. They never spoke of what had happened, of the auction, of Silas, of the moment they stood together against the threat. They didn't need words. They had built something here, not out of grand design, but out of necessity, resilience, and a quiet, fundamental goodness that existed even in the dust. Eleanor looked at Lily and Thomas, playing in the patch of sunlight outside the cabin. They were not burdens, not property, but a future she had fought for and won. Her heart, once an empty vessel, was full to bursting. She had come to this desolate place broken and alone, but she had found strength in the face of despair, built a family from nothing, and discovered dignity not in what she possessed, but in what she protected. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together, a quiet partnership forged in hardship, standing resilient against the world.